Have you ever seen someone so underestimated, so casually dismissed, that the world nearly missed their greatness? Welcome to Twilight Tales, where truth hides in plain sight and justice often comes when no one expects it. If you're visiting for the first time, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because the story you're about to hear is not just powerful, it's unforgettable. Let's talk about Grace. She wore an apron, carried trays, cleaned dishes in silence. And yet, the man who mocked her, the man who laughed with his billionaire friends and thought his wealth gave him permission to insult her, he didn't know she was hiding something far greater than pride. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself with anger. She waited until the moment was right, until the whole room went silent, until her words shattered his confidence and exposed the truth no one saw coming. This is the story of a quiet black maid who endured years of belittlement, until a single moment flipped everything upside down. It's about the arrogance of the rich, the humility of the wise, and how power isn't always held by those who wear suits and sign checks. Sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is the one no one even notices. By the end of this video, you'll realize that wealth isn't always about money. It's about how you treat others even when you think they have nothing. Stay with us as we tell you how Grace's quiet strength, sharp mind, and well-timed truth turned humiliation into legacy, and left a billionaire utterly speechless. Because in this tale, respect isn't given, it's earned. Grace wasn't born into wealth. She didn't wear designer shoes or drive flashy cars. Her days began before the sun rose, and they ended long after it set. Clad in a pressed uniform and soft-soled shoes, she moved through the halls of the Lennox estate like a whisper, quiet, unnoticed, but always present. To most people in that house, she was simply the maid. But Grace? She was so much more. Each morning she tied her hair back, packed a small lunch in a cloth she'd had for years, kissed the photo of her late husband sitting on her dresser, and caught the 5:30 a.m. bus. It didn't matter that she lived in a small home on the edge of town. It didn't matter that she sometimes had to skip breakfast to afford her grandson's school fees. Grace showed up. Every day. At the Lennox estate, she polished floors that had never seen dirt, arranged flowers flown in from Holland, and served meals she could never dream of affording. She did it all with a calm grace that made her seem invisible. But she wasn't. Grace noticed everything. She noticed how the guests would drop their voices when she entered a room, assuming she couldn't understand them. She noticed how Mrs. Lennox would nod politely at her in public but bark orders behind closed doors. She noticed how the younger house staff copied her work ethic but still whispered that she was just too quiet to be interesting. What they didn't know was that Grace had once lived a life that was anything but quiet. But she never corrected them. Never raised her voice. Never revealed her past. Not even when her hands ached or her knees threatened to give out. Because Grace had a reason for being there. A reason she never shared. She wasn't looking for pity. She wasn't looking for praise. She was watching. Testing. Waiting. For something, or someone, to finally reveal who they really were. Because Grace didn't believe in masks. And at the Lennox estate, nearly everyone wore one. She had taken the job after her husband passed, after a lifetime of accomplishments that she tucked away like folded memories in a drawer. Now she wanted nothing more than to live quietly, do honest work, and make sure her grandson had a better future than she ever could have imagined. But what no one realized, especially not the Lennox family, was that Grace hadn't taken this job out of desperation. She had chosen it. And the day she would finally reveal why was coming soon. The Lennox estate had hosted many powerful men, but none had the presence or arrogance of Donovan Kane. He was everything the tabloids loved and the staff dreaded. Billionaire. Investor. Real estate tycoon. Known for buying up distressed properties and flipping them into elite resorts, Kane had earned a reputation for turning dust into gold, and for treating people like they were disposable in the process. When Kane visited, the house transformed. Security swept through every inch of the property, fresh white roses were placed in every hallway, and the kitchen served imported delicacies Kane rarely even touched. His presence was a performance, an exhibition of dominance, and he expected everyone to play their part. Especially the help. Grace noticed it the second he walked in. He didn't acknowledge the staff. He tossed his coat onto a chair without a glance. His voice boomed through the marble halls, followed by forced laughter from men desperate for his approval. And then, like clockwork, came the comment, low enough to seem private, loud enough for Grace to hear. Funny how they always hire the quiet ones. She probably thinks that apron makes her invisible. He was talking about her. She didn't flinch. She simply placed a silver tray on the table and stepped back, her expression calm, unreadable. Kane wasn't done. At dinner he spoke about profits, power, and how the problem with people these days was that they expected respect before they earned it. Grace, standing silently by the wall, became his target again. "You there?" he said, snapping his fingers. "Yes, you. What's your name again?" "Doesn't matter. Come here." She approached without hesitation. "You know," Kane continued, smirking, "if you want a raise you should at least try to smile. That sour look makes me think I'm paying too much tax to keep this house running." The room chuckled. Grace said nothing. He leaned back and added, "And if it makes you feel better, my salary is yours. Every time you clean this table you're wiping crumbs off money you'll never see." More laughter. Grace met his eyes. "Just for a second. Come. Unmoving." And then she turned and walked away, her posture as poised as ever. Kane blinked. Something in her eyes had unsettled him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't embarrassment. It was patience. "She's got attitude," he muttered. "Better be careful with that one." What Kane didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Grace had seen men like him before. In corporate boardrooms. In private clubs. In gala events where she wore gowns instead of aprons. She knew how they talked, how they walked, how they needed to feel bigger than everyone else to believe they mattered. But she also knew something else. They always exposed themselves. Eventually, Grace didn't need to humiliate him in front of everyone. She just had to wait for the right moment. And it was closer than anyone realized. It was supposed to be just another evening at the Lennox estate. A casual business dinner, a few investors, and more shallow talk of market shares and rising stock portfolios. But beneath the polished glasses and flickering candlelight, tension brewed, one that would finally snap in the most unexpected way. Grace had prepared the room like always. Every detail perfect. Silver gleaming, napkins folded with precision, the Lennox crest displayed like royalty. But tonight, Kane was in rare form, emboldened, intoxicated by his own ego and hungry for attention. He needed a target. And Grace, quiet, composed, and unbothered by his previous insults, became the one he wanted to break. "Bring the wine," he barked from the end of the table. "And hurry this time. I didn't come here to watch molasses move." Grace calmly approached with the tray, her hands steady. As she reached across the table to pour, Kane leaned back, watching her like a lion circling prey. "You know," he said with a grin, "there's something fascinating about people like you. Always serving. Always beneath someone. Must be exhausting, pretending you matter." The room froze. A few forced chuckles escaped from the guests. Mr. Lennox gave an awkward cough but didn't speak. Grace finished pouring the wine. No flinch. No glare. She turned to move away. But Kane wasn't done. "You probably think you're strong, don't you? Stoic. Noble. But let's be honest, if you disappeared tomorrow, who in this room would notice?" That was it. The moment broke like glass under pressure. Grace stopped. She turned slowly, elegantly, and faced Kane. Her eyes didn't burn with rage. They glimmered with something far more dangerous, certainty. "Sir," she said, her voice low but sharp, "I was taught never to interrupt a man enjoying the sound of his own ignorance." The room gasped. Utter silence. Kane's smile faded. "Excuse me?" he sneered. Grace stepped forward, just enough for her words to land squarely in his chest. "You confuse power with value. Wealth with wisdom. And yourself, with someone important." Kane stood, towering over her. "You're fired." She nodded once, calmly. "Of course." She removed her apron, folded it neatly on the table, and turned to leave. But just as she reached the door, she paused. "I wasn't here to serve you, Mr. Kane," she said. "I was here to observe you." Then she walked out. The guests stared, stunned. Kane's face was flushed red, his lips twitching with confusion and rage. "What the hell does that mean?" he growled. Nobody answered. Because in that one moment, Grace had shifted the entire balance of the room. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't thrown anything. She had simply spoken truth wrapped in dignity. And everyone, especially Kane, felt it. What they didn't know was that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Because tomorrow morning, the world would learn exactly who Grace really was. And why her silence had always been the loudest voice in the room. The next morning, the Lennox estate was buzzing with whispers. Grace had not returned. Her room, once so neatly kept, was completely cleared out. No clothes. No suitcase. Not even a note. It was like she had never been there at all. Mr. Lennox tried to call her. No answer. The house manager tried the number listed on her application. Disconnected. Kane laughed it off, still stinging from the public humiliation. Typical, he said, sipping his espresso. The help gets emotional and runs off. She should have thanked me for giving her a taste of high society. But not everyone was laughing. By noon, the headlines started appearing. Former corporate strategist living as maid in billionaire's estate. Grace Mbeki, heiress turned anonymous philanthropist? Kane choked on his drink. He grabbed his phone, skimming through article after article, each revealing more than the last. Photos from a decade ago. Grace in a navy blue business suit, standing beside African presidents and Fortune 500 CEOs. Speaking at global forums. Featured on Forbes' top 30 under 30 list. Before she disappeared. According to the reports, Grace Mbeki was once one of the most sought-after financial strategists in Africa. The daughter of Emmanuel Mbeki, an oil magnate and beloved philanthropist who passed away mysteriously, Grace had inherited more than just his wealth, she had inherited his enemies too. After her father's death, she vanished from the public eye. No one knew where she'd gone. Until now. Kane's hand shook. She was rich, he stammered. What was she doing scrubbing dishes? That was the question on everyone's mind. But the truth was more layered than anyone guessed. Grace had gone underground to protect herself. Rumors swirled about people trying to steal her inheritance, about boardroom betrayals and corrupt government officials. Living among the elite made her a target. So she did the unthinkable, she disappeared into simplicity. The Lennox family never knew who she really was. They thought she was just another maid. But Grace had quietly been investing, helping local communities through anonymous donations, even funding small African tech startups under a shell foundation. The woman who served wine and washed floors was worth more than Kane's entire portfolio. And she had never needed validation from anyone in that room. The staff couldn't believe it. I always knew she carried herself like someone important, the cook whispered. She used to correct the accountant's ledgers when she thought no one was looking, said the butler. I thought it was just pride. But she was trained. Kane stormed through the estate, yelling at everyone, demanding answers. She played us all, he shouted. She tricked me. But deep down he knew, Grace hadn't tricked him. She had simply never bowed to his game. And that made him furious. His arrogance, his mockery, his so-called generosity, they had been wasted on someone who had more wealth, more grace, and more class than he could ever imagine. And worse? She never needed a stage to prove it. She simply waited for the right time to let the truth rise to the surface, like gold in mud. Kane was still pacing when the estate's security guard approached him, holding a sealed envelope. This was delivered by courier, sir, he said cautiously. It's addressed to you. From Miss Grace. Kane snatched the envelope and tore it open, half expecting some cryptic farewell or a demand letter. But what he found inside was something far more unnerving. It was a letter. Handwritten. Elegant script. Grace's signature at the bottom. Attached to it was a photocopy of a legal document, a last will and testament, Emmanuel Mbeki's will. The letter read, Dear Kane, I never intended to reveal who I was. Not to you. Not to anyone in that house. But after last night, I realized you need to understand something, what true wealth looks like. And more importantly, what grace feels like when it's not for sale. Enclosed is my father's will. You'll notice Clause 11. It names me sole inheritor of all Mbeki assets and trusts, valued at over $9.5 million. That figure has grown, by the way. You mocked me while I wore an apron, thinking that defined me. I could buy the Lennox estate 3 times over, but I chose to sweep its floors. That's power, Kane. Not the kind you shout about, but the kind that speaks when it chooses to. Grace. Kane blinked at the will, his fingers trembling. Clause 11 stood out clearly. All holdings, assets, and accounts, domestic and international, shall be passed to my daughter, Grace Mbeki, without restriction or trustee intervention. Kane dropped the papers on the table, stunned. His chest tightened. She had sat in silence at that estate, listening to him brag about his investments, his shallow knowledge of African business markets, even once laughing that real wealth doesn't wear second-hand shoes. And all that time, she had been the embodiment of everything he pretended to be. Just then Mr. Lennox entered the room. Have you seen the news, Kane? She's in it. Everywhere. He tossed his tablet on the table. The headline blared. Grace Mbeki to launch $2 million Women's Empowerment Fund in Ghana. There she was, in a crisp beige suit, no longer the maid but the mogul, standing beside local leaders and smiling gently for the cameras. Kane couldn't speak. You humiliated her, Mr. Lennox said, shaking his head. And she didn't retaliate with hate. She just walked out, and reminded the world who she is. Kane collapsed into a chair. He remembered the things he'd said. The laughter. The smirk on his face when he mocked her accent, her shoes, her silence. He thought she was invisible. Now the whole world saw her. And Kane? He was reduced to nothing more than a footnote in her legacy, a bitter man who once tried to break a woman who couldn't be bent. For Grace, the revelation wasn't just about the will. It was about restoring dignity, not just hers, but for every woman who had ever been told she wasn't enough because she wasn't loud, rich, or white. And as Kane sat there, rattled, broken, ashamed, he finally understood something. Grace had never lost. She had been winning in silence all along. The fallout came swiftly. By the next morning, social media was ablaze. Hashtags like #GraceMbecky, #SilentStrength, and #MadeToMogul trended globally. People praised Grace for her composure, her humility, and most of all, her quiet strength in the face of blatant humiliation. Kane, meanwhile, was being dragged across every platform. Clips of the dinner party went viral. His mocking tone, the moment he told Grace, "And my salary is yours," now replayed millions of times over with scathing commentary. He said that to a millionaire? This is what privilege looks like. She wore an apron better than he wore his suit. Kane's business partners began distancing themselves. His inbox was filled with media requests, investors demanding answers, and furious shareholders who feared association with a man now viewed as an arrogant elitist. He couldn't hide anymore. Under pressure, Kane finally agreed to a televised interview. He sat stiffly on a news set, wearing a navy suit that suddenly felt too heavy. The lights were hot. The cameras unforgiving. I want to apologize," he began, voice cracking. "To Grace Mbeki. To every woman I disrespected with my ignorance. I didn't know who she was, but that's not the point. I shouldn't have treated anyone like that." The interviewer didn't let him off easy. "You said, 'And my salary is yours,' in front of a room full of people," she pressed. "Now we know she could have bought your entire company. How does that feel?" Kane swallowed hard. "I was foolish, arrogant. I judged her by what she wore, not who she was." A long silence followed. The internet had mixed reactions. Some people felt he was just saving face. Others hoped he had learned his lesson. But Grace didn't comment. Not publicly. Instead, she let her actions continue to speak. She issued no statements. Filed no lawsuits. Made no attempt to retaliate or claim revenge. Her silence echoed louder than any words Kane could offer. And that silence, graceful, deliberate, was what humbled him the most. He began volunteering, quietly and consistently, at a women's financial literacy center. Not for the cameras. Not for redemption. But because, for the first time, he genuinely wanted to understand the world beyond his own privilege. Meanwhile, Grace's story became a symbol. She was invited to speak at global leadership forums. Universities wanted her as a guest lecturer. Her foundation's website crashed from too many donations. Women from all over the continent wrote letters thanking her for showing them that silence doesn't mean weakness, and that dignity can't be stripped by a uniform. The irony? Grace never chased fame. She never shouted her truth. She just lived it. And Kane? He learned that apologies don't erase the past, but they can start to build a different future, one brick of humility at a time. His name may never recover, but his heart was finally beginning to. While Kane's world was unraveling, Grace's was quietly expanding. Far away from the noise of the media storm, Grace sat in a sunlit office overlooking the streets of Accra. It wasn't a skyscraper or an opulent mansion. It was a modest building she purchased near the heart of the city, where real change could reach real people. The gold plaque on the door read, "Mbeki Women's Empowerment Initiative." This was her new mission. Her new chapter. Her inheritance was never just about the money. Grace had long ago stopped measuring wealth in figures. For her, real power came in helping others rewrite their stories, just as she had rewritten hers. She hired women who had once been overlooked like she had. Housekeepers, former maids, single mothers, war survivors. Not out of pity but out of recognition. Because she knew their strength. She had worn their shoes. "Your uniform doesn't define your ceiling," she told every new hire. Workshops launched, business training, legal literacy, microloans for women with dreams bigger than their circumstances. She personally mentored young women who reminded her of herself. Quiet, underestimated, but carrying fires in their hearts. Grace even established a scholarship fund in her father's name, for girls from rural villages who had never seen the inside of a college classroom. She didn't need interviews or red carpet events. Her success wasn't built for cameras. It was built for impact. And yet, her name became known in rooms she had once only cleaned. One evening, Grace received a handwritten note from the president's office. She'd been invited to attend a private state dinner honoring African women leading the next century. At the bottom, scrawled in blue ink, was a personal message. Your story didn't just inspire us, it reminded us that strength wears many faces. Thank you for leading by example. Grace smiled. She remembered standing in Kane's estate kitchen, wiping down counters as people laughed around her. That girl was still in her, but now she held the pen. A reporter once asked her why she never retaliated publicly. Why she didn't humiliate Kane the way he'd humiliated her. Grace answered softly, because I know who I am. And when you know that, you don't need to shout it at anyone. You just walk it. She didn't need Kane's apology to validate her. His downfall was never her mission. Her silence, her poise, her refusal to fight dirty, that was her power. But Grace did send him something. It was a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the apron she wore at his estate, folded neatly, cleaned and pressed. No note. No message. Just a quiet reminder of who she was, and how far she had come. Kane kept it. Hung it in his office. Not out of shame, but as a symbol of the moment that changed everything. Grace Mbeki was no longer just a name on a will. She was a movement. A testimony. Proof that dignity can never be mocked out of someone who truly carries it. And as the sun set on her past, 1,000 doors opened to the future she was now building, not alone but for millions. And so, from the marble halls of a billionaire's mansion to the sun-drenched streets of Accra, Grace Mbeki's journey became something far greater than a tale of revenge or riches. It became a lesson. A lesson in grace under fire. A lesson in knowing your worth even when others don't see it. A lesson that the quietest voices can sometimes create the loudest echoes in history. When Kane mocked her, he didn't just insult a maid, he underestimated a legacy. A woman raised with values, strength, and quiet fire by a man who left her not just money, but a mission. And Grace? She didn't take the stage with noise. She took it with presence. With silence, resilience, and dignity that didn't need a headline to matter. She taught us something we often forget in a world addicted to status and spectacle. True power doesn't brag, it builds. She didn't throw her money in Kane's face. She didn't buy his company or humiliate him on camera. She simply rose above him, and kept rising. Now look at her. Empowering women across the continent. Funding dreams. Turning shame into scholarships. Changing narratives not for revenge but for rebirth. Kane, for all his billions, will be remembered for one thing. The moment he said, "And my salary is yours," and learned that sometimes that very salary doesn't buy class, wisdom, or heart. But Grace? Grace will be remembered as a symbol. Of quiet strength. Of second chances. Of what it truly means to rise from the shadows without stepping on others to get to the light. So, what does her story teach you? Maybe you're in a place where you're overlooked, disrespected, or doubted. Maybe you've been told to stay quiet, to stay in your place. But remember this, Grace Mbeki started with an apron and ended with influence. You don't need validation to start. You need vision. And maybe, just maybe, your story is next. Before you go, we want to thank you for spending your time with us here on Twilight Tales, where stories shine a light on the truths we often miss in everyday life. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect, then do us a favor. Backhand index pointing right like this video. Backhand index pointing right, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Backhand index pointing right, subscribe to Twilight Tales for more powerful, real, and unforgettable stories. Backhand index pointing right and drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were Grace? Let's keep this conversation alive. Let's continue to tell stories that change hearts, and sometimes the world. Until next time, remember, your story matters and the world is waiting to hear it.